gostaria de dizer e desejar a todos, então, uma ótima noite. Vamos, então, para o nosso terceiro turno. Eu sei que foi um dia extremamente pesado, mas importante, e assim como forma de nós alimentarmos a nossa alma e de nós relaxarmos um pouco, a proposta, então, de duas pessoas que vão tocar o acordeão para nós hoje à noite aqui. Eles vão se apresentar depois, uns 10 minutos antes da palestra, então, do professor Jeffrey Barash, que já está tudo preparado, então. Nós temos o prazer, então, de ouvir o professor André, então eu já digo o nome dele, por favor, e Helena, então, tá?
Muito boa noite. Então, agradecer ao professor Luiz Roden pelo convite. Eu sou André Machado, professor de acordeon, acordeonista do Quinteto Perche, quinteto de acordeon, o único quinteto de acordeon do Brasil, com atividades desde 99. A gente iniciou em 99 e nos conhecemos, eu e o professor Luiz Roden, por meio da sua filha, que estuda acordeon comigo. Depois iremos tocar duas músicas juntos. A primeira música que eu vou tocar é um clássico da Bossa Nova, de Tom Jobim e Vinícius de Moraes, Eu Sei Que Vou Te Amar. Segunda música, um clássico dos Beatles, de John Lennon e Paul McCartney, Yesterday. agora de uns compositores que talvez mais importantes do século XX, e o instrumento dele era o bandoneon, mas tem muito a ver com o acordeon, que é o Astor Piazzolla. Toco um dos cartões de visita dele, que é o Libertango. Convido agora a Helena Roden para fazer parte comigo, um duo. Nós vamos tocar duas músicas e a metodologia que a gente usa é sempre buscar músicas que o estudante de acordeon esteja interessado em tocar e músicas que sejam do cotidiano. Então, iremos tocar Merceditas de Ramon Sisto Rios, que é um clássico aqui latino-americano, e uma música que teve um sucesso gigantesco no mundo inteiro, do Luiz Fonsi, que é o Despacito. Então, por favor, Helena Roden, com vocês, Helena Roden.
Bom, obrigado, André, obrigado, Helena, por essa apresentação, e é isso, então, tá bom? Então, eu tenho, em continuidade aos nossos trabalhos, eu chamo então aqui à mesa o professor Jeffrey Barash, por favor. O Jeffrey Barash nos brinda com a sua presença e ele está lançando um livro que se chama Collective Memory and the Historical Past, Martin Heidegger and the Problem of Historical Meaning. E ele, na verdade, não vai falar sobre isso para nós hoje à noite, mas é uma palestra que ele vai dar na Argentina. E hoje à noite ele vai falar para nós sobre uma outra temática. E nós procedemos da seguinte forma: ele vai falar em inglês, slowly, e ao mesmo tempo o texto vai ser apresentado, traduzido aqui na frente. Então vocês têm a possibilidade de listening e ao mesmo tempo ver o texto aqui exposto então na tela. E sem mais delongas, eu passo a palavra. É uma grande alegria, realmente uma honra tê-lo presente nessa noite aqui. A big honor have you here.
And I'm very pleased and honored to be here. And I would like to thank Professor Roden for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak here tonight. The title of my talk is The Time of Collective Memory, Social Cohesion and Historical Discontinuity in Paul Ricoeur's Memory, History, and Forgetting. No, not close, more, okay. Paul Ricoeur chose as the illustration for the cover of his book, Memory, History, Forgetting, the photograph of an 18th century Baroque statue found in Dibblingen Abbey in Ulm, Germany, that represents history in the winged god of Kronos. You can see the first, that's the original, the photo of the original that Paul Ricoeur chose. You can go to the next slide. And so you see the cover of his book. Now you go back to the text. The sculpture that you just saw depicts an ancient allegory of the god Kronos, who sits with a book between his hands while tearing out one of the pages. History, portrayed as a standing young woman with a stylus, an inkwell, and a book in her right hand, attempts with her left hand to restrain the destructive act of the god. Ricoeur interpreted this allegory in a brief handwritten commentary under the photograph of the statue reproduced a second time in the first pages of the book, and it's handwritten in the book. He wrote, "Between the laceration, le déchirement, by the wings of time, and the writing of history and its stylus." From the very cover of the book, the author of Memory, History, Forgetting symbolically evoked its principal theme: human beings, to redress the effects of laceration, of discontinuity, of break, call upon memory of the past and inscribe it in history. In the face of laceration, discontinuity, and break, rupture, memory and its historical inscription over time aim to lend cohesion to human collectivities. The great interest of memory, history, forgetting lies in its manner of analyzing social cohesion, not as a uniform bond, but in terms of human plurality that arises from a diversity of perspectives and of remembering groups rooted in complex stratifications and concatenations. It is this role of memory and of its historical inscription as a source of social cohesion which is subject to rupture and also to dissolution over time that I will analyze in the talk that follows. I will first identify the source of this social cohesion for which memory and history, according to Ricoeur, provide an essential precondition. And following this, I will focus on the significance and scope of temporal rupture or break, of discontinuity to which this social cohesion is subject. My purpose is twofold. In examining Ricoeur's response to these questions, I aim to place his thought in a somewhat critical light in order to set in relief what I take to be an important aporia, a barrier it encounters. This will permit me to conclude by drawing out what I take to be the ethical implications of my remarks, and also to a certain extent of Ricoeur's own philosophy of memory in La Mémoire, l'Histoire, l'Oubli. I will proceed by setting in relief three sources of social cohesion for which memory, according to Ricoeur, in Memory, History, and Forgetting, plays an essential role. The first source is inspired by the philosophy of Wilhelm Dilthey. Dilthey, as Ricoeur tells us, interprets social cohesion in relation to what he termed the cohesion of life, der Zusammenhang des Lebens, through which the life of the individual is interwoven with the lives of members of the group. Beginning with the work Time and Narrative, Temps et Récit, Ricoeur examined the way in which Dilthey conceived of the generation, la génération, and of the series of generations as the source of unity among individuals who belong to the same temporal period, and distinguishing them from members of earlier and later generations, in other words, contemporaneous groups. In this work, Ricoeur focused on the generation as the vital time span serving to mediate, along with calendar time and the trace, between the two orders of cosmic time measured by the movement of the planets and the time of lived experience. In Memory, History, Forgetting, Ricoeur expanded this role of the generation, but it was more important in this work still, in relation to the work of Maurice Halbwachs in his famous book, Collective Memory, and also of Alfred Schutz, The Phenomenology of the Social World. For Halbwachs, collective memory arises from experience retained in the memory of contemporaries who belong to the same temporal context. As Ricoeur emphasized in his analysis of Halbwachs, younger contemporaries, in the course of the succession of living generations, become aware of previous contexts revealed by the living memory communicated by their parents and grandparents. And I cite a passage of Ricoeur in which he talks about Halbwachs in this sense. Ricoeur writes, the French edition that's on page 514, it is an intense experience that contributes to widening the circle of close relations by opening it in the direction of a past, which even while bringing to those of our elders who are still living, places us in communication with the experiences of a generation other than our own. The notion of generation, that is the key here, offers the twofold sense of the contemporaneousness of the same generation to which belong beings of different ages, and the succession of generations in the sense of the replacement of one generation by another. If Paul Ricoeur drew on Halbwachs' thought in this way, he did not hesitate to express his reservations concerning Halbwachs' sociological orientation. You remember the Milwaukee is quite critical of this. In the brief section of Ricoeur's book that deals with collective memory, he challenged what he took to be Halbwachs' overemphasis on social ties to the point of deriding individual consciousness itself from the often unperceived influence of a social milieu. On this basis, Ricoeur rejected Halbach's conception of collective memory and sought a more appropriate theoretical model to account for the cohesion of social life that collective memory enables. On the basis of a phenomenology of the social world, Alfred Schutz presented what he considered to be a more satisfactory analysis of the concept of the generation. Schutz indeed proposed to analyze the temporal realms of predecessors and successors, extending in the two directions of past and future. Yet there is no specific indication in the very short passage Ricoeur devoted to this approach concerning the way in which it might serve to clarify the problem of social cohesion in its relation to collective memory. Ricoeur's attempt to resolve this problem found a more substantial inspiration in the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl, which provides a second source of reflection on the foundations of social cohesion. At an earlier stage in his philosophical work, Ricoeur had admittedly placed in question the legacy of transcendental idealism bequeathed by Descartes and by Kant, which Husserl's phenomenological method reinterpreted and renewed. In his debate with Husserlian phenomenology, Ricoeur leveled his criticism against Husserl's claim to provide an absolute foundation for the pure sphere of the cogito, while maintaining this earlier critique in Memory, History, Forgetting. Ricoeur drew on Husserl's theory of intersubjectivity for his conception of communal cohesion. Ricoeur highlighted in this perspective the theory of the shared world and of the apperception of the other in the communal sphere that Husserl elaborated in the fifth of the Cartesian Meditations. In stressing the fundamental role of individual consciousness, Husserl developed a concept of analogical relations between members of a shared world to serve as the basis for a general theory of intersubjectivity in the framework of what he designated as a higher intersubjective community. Ricoeur likewise sought to ground the phenomenon of intersubjective coexistence in a common world in analogical relations between individual members of a community, in the analogical transfer that enables each individual ego to identify with an alter ego. To Ricoeur's mind, Husserl's phenomenological approach in preserving the role of individual reflexivity was able to avoid the sociological tendency he rejected in Halbach's method, which to his eyes threatened to dissolve individual consciousness into the omnipresent atmosphere of a collective milieu. And the originality of his theory lay in his identification of the analogical basis of intersubjective relations at the heart of the cohesive function of collective memory. I will cite one passage of La Mémoire, l'Histoire, l'Oubli, which is really, to my mind, the decisive passage in this relation, in the establishment of this relation between individuals in the analogical relation of collective memory. Ricoeur writes on page 145 of the French edition of La Mémoire, l'Histoire, l'Oubli, and I cite, by reason of this analogical transfer, we are authorized to use the first person in the plural form and ascribe to an us, whomever this may be, all of the prerogatives of memory, mindness, continuity, the past-future polarity. With this hypothesis, it is important, however, not to forget that it is only by analogy and in relation to individual consciousness and its memory that collective memory is held to be a collection of traces left by the events that have affected the course of history of the groups concerned, and that it is accorded the power to place on stage these common memories on the occasion of holidays, rites, and public celebrations. In spite of Ricoeur's valiant effort, the attempt to solve the problem here by no means provides a satisfactory answer to the question of intersubjective cohesion, as Ricoeur himself conceived of it. How might one admit, as a principle of intersubjective cohesion, an analogical transfer arising, as Ricoeur frankly acknowledged, from a relation between individuals? For Husserl himself, the passage from the level of the individual to that of the collectivity on the basis of an analogical relation posed no particular problem, since individual consciousness and all intersubjective communication depend on a uniform foundation in the pure subjectivity of the cogito. In the framework of transcendental philosophy, the diversity of singular perspectives is united in advance on the basis of shared a priori structures that are exempt from temporal modification. However, once Ricoeur rejected the model of the transcendental ego, what authorizes his call for analogical interpretation that in Husserl's theory proposed a pure transcendental basis for intersubjectivity? My point is a little bit critical that in Memory, History, and Forgetting, Ricoeur did not provide an answer to this question. So this is where I'm taking up his analysis and proposing to go a little bit further along the same route. A seminal topic to which Ricoeur basically alluded at in various passages in Memory, History, Forgetting, concerning the symbolic configuration of intersubjective experience, is curiously absent in his brief discussion of collective memory. Yet, it suggests to my mind a third field of reflection that permits us to account for the phenomenon of intersubjective cohesion. As I interpret it, this field may fulfill the task that Ricoeur set out to accomplish, that of steering between the Charybdis of Halbach's sociological approach and the Scylla of the pure cogito posited by Husserl's transcendental phenomenology. The absence in Memory, History, Forgetting of a detailed analysis of the symbol in relation to memory and the configuration of social cohesion is all the more noteworthy in view of the importance of the topic of the symbol at earlier points in the elaboration of his oeuvre, from the living metaphor on interpretation and essay on Freud up through time and narrative. This absence of a full discussion of the function of the symbol in Memory, History, and Forgetting is further complicated by the fact that in earlier works, Ricoeur defined the symbol in different ways. I propose, therefore, to pursue my investigation by focusing on different significations of the symbol that Ricoeur himself adopted in his earlier work in order to interpret the ways in which symbols, as deployed by collective memory, forge the ties of collective memory, of social cohesion, In accompanying Ricoeur along his path of reflection, I aim in this manner to suggest a way out of the dilemma of his theory of collective memory encounters in its role of configuring intersubjective cohesion. By way of this analysis, I will return at the end to the theme of laceration and discontinuity over time that is a principal concern of his work as a whole. Let us turn to a closer examination of the concept of the symbol itself, which takes on different meanings both in the Western tradition and in different periods in Ricoeur's oeuvre. I will limit my analysis to two articulations of the concept that correspond to Ricoeur's principal concerns. The first articulation relates to the broad sense of the term symbol associated with the original Greek term symbalein, to throw together, to fuse, to gather up, to compare. According to this meaning, one thing may stand for another, like a token, a colored slip of paper, a word, which designates something other than itself. In the work of Aristotle, above all in Book 1 of De Interpretatione, the philosopher equated language with a symbolic expression. Language deploys symbols according to Aristotle's theory. Following a long and complex historical development of this broad conception of the symbol, Goethe revived it in the modern period. In the 20th century, it has been above all associated with the work of Ernst Cassirer, who reformulated it in his philosophy of symbolic forms in the 1920s, where it took on its broadest sense, which is of particular interest for Ricoeur and for our present investigation. According to Cassirer, the function of the symbol, beyond that of a sign or signal, is to configure reality as such. Time, space, number, conceptual logic in general, far from uniform structures, pattern experience in different ways in accord with the symbolic domains in which they are deployed. Language is the primary symbolic form for Cassirer, but myth, religion, art, science are among other symbolic forms through which reality is made intelligible. According to this conception, space and time, the concepts of number and cause, fulfill different functions in the domains of myth, religion, art, or science. In changing according to their field of application, they account for a variety of possibilities of configuration of the intersubjective realm. The second conception of the symbol is more narrow. It is closely tied to the Christian tradition, in which the symbol refers to a superior realm which cannot be grasped in the domain of sensuous apprehension. Thus, the lamb represents Christ, who sacrificed himself for humankind. The goldfinch, for a long oral and iconographic tradition since the Middle Ages, represents Christ's resurrection. These are symbols that evoke the idea of transcendence beyond the sensuous world. In the modern period, Immanuel Kant adopted this definition of the symbol in paragraph 59 of the Critique of Judgment, where he defined it as a representation of what could not be presented in direct sensuous intuition. Here he referred not only to religious symbolism, but to emblematic signs of what could not be made visible as objects of sense experience, a unified body and soul that represent monarchy, which governs in accord with established laws, or a machine, such as a windmill, to stand for despotism, according to Kant's famous example. Ricoeur's early work, notably in his book La Symbolique du Mal, initially developed his concept of the symbol in the perspective of Christian theology. Later works, such as Freud and Philosophy, reiterated this perspective in the framework of what Ricoeur himself called a phenomenology of religion. At the beginning of his work, Freud and Philosophy, Ricoeur sharply criticized Cassirer's concept of the symbol, as he elaborated in the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, sharply taking him to task for unifying all of the, I quote Ricoeur, for unifying all of the functions of mediation under the title of the symbolic, and thus making this concept as broad as reality and culture, which in this early period Ricoeur then rejects. This conception of the symbol was, to his eyes, far too broad to serve the purpose of hermeneutic philosophy. Against this definition, Ricoeur interpreted the symbolic function to be indirect, in that it means something other than what is said, thus requiring the act of deciphering, of hermeneutics. This indeed leaves room for a specific designation of the kind of meaning that is not directly presented in sense experience, but which in lying outside of its limits requires the kind of interpretive deciphering that has traditionally been the province of hermeneutics. 18 years later, in the first volume of Time and Narrative, Ricoeur's perspective changed. Without mentioning his earlier critique of Ernst Cassier's philosophy, developed in Freud and philosophy, Ricoeur referred directly to Cassier and the philosophy of symbolic forms. And I quote Ricoeur on page, volume 1, page 9, very beginning of Temps et Récit. Ricoeur writes, I have opted for a use close to that of Cassier in his philosophy of symbolic forms, inasmuch as for him, symbolic forms are cultural processes that articulate experience as a whole. If I speak more precisely of symbolic mediation, it is to distinguish among symbols of a cultural nature the ones that underlie action and that constitute its first signification before autonomous symbolic wholes, dependent upon speaking or writing, become detached from the practical level. In this sense, we might speak of an implicit or immanent symbolism in opposition to an explicit or autonomous one. So here, Ricoeur broadens his definition of this symbol. This notion of symbolic mediation is of particular interest for our present investigation, since it reintroduces the theory of the symbol as a source of intersubjective cohesion, which I would like to elucidate more closely. In the same passage in which he dealt with Cassier, Paul Ricoeur also referred to the theory of the symbol elaborated by the American anthropologist Clifford Geertz in his book, The Interpretation of Cultures. Although he underscored the similarity of their approaches to the symbol as a general cultural phenomenon, Ricoeur did not allude to the fact that Geertz, in spite of the central role he accorded to the symbol in the field of culture, questioned the constitutive role that Cassier ascribed to the symbolic form as a source of human experience. Nonetheless, what is of particular importance for my discussion is the manner in which Ricoeur, at a decisive moment in his development, drew on the perspective of Ernst Cassier. It is unfortunate that he never elaborated on this interpretation in his later work. And in La Mémoire d'Histoire l'Oubli, he did briefly evoke the theory of the symbol deployed in the anthropology of Clifford Geertz, but he did not relate this theory of the symbol, which is discussed in a very interesting way in La Mémoire d'Histoire l'Oubli, but he does not relate it directly to the theory of collective memory. So, after accompanying Ricoeur up to this point, with our three ways of establishing social cohesion, I would like to elucidate the way in which a broader interpretation of the symbol, which he adopts in volume 1 of Temps et Récit, in accord then with this interpretation, permits us to more clearly identify the problem of social cohesion that, to my mind, Ricoeur did not entirely resolve. Much like Ricoeur, my own theoretical engagement with collective memory has led me to renounce any claim to an absolute foundation in pure subjectivity bequeathed by the tradition of transcendental phenomenology, or transcendental idealism, more generally. And I leave aside also the question of symbolic forms as constitutive sources of our understanding of reality. This is not what interests me. What interests me is rather the possibility of a collective communicability of experience, possibility of communicating experience to others through symbols. My concern is with the configuration of the public sphere through embodied symbols which draw on experience sedimented in the deep levels of collective memory. As I interpret it, the possibility of communicating with others, and even with oneself, presupposes the prior existence of symbols forming a network of interwoven significations which individuals, since early childhood, appropriate and share with others through language, gesture, style. When placed in this perspective, symbolic significance is not a tool or an instrument. Symbols establish the sphere of communicability or of the communicable that awareness of self and of others assumes. As a symbolic network that is deployed in a multitude of stratifications, they concern not only individuals or smaller groups, but at the most general level, vast collectivities. Here we encounter a precondition of all intersubjective experience, which has an extra-individual and a meta-personal scope. These symbolic networks, far from being monolithic structures, are fragmented according to the perspective of the group that interprets them. It is through the cohesion and continuity of these intertwined symbolic networks that the past and the present are joined together in a horizon of experience and remembrance that is turned toward the future, shared by contemporary generations of different ages whose lifespans overlap. In this framework, it is not simply a question of explicit experience and remembrance, but also of the implicit, the latent level that draw on multiple reservoirs of significations that are latent sources of interpretation deployed among vast collectivities. Beyond acts of remembrance that are mobilized during commemorations or in museum displays, I refer here to a much more general possibility of tacit communication that arises from the passive levels underlying experience. These passive networks are concrete preconditions of group existence in a shared world. Be this as it may, if these passive networks are usually not an object of direct reflection, they may be brought to awareness and in a certain measure transformed, for example, by the active choice of habits and conventional practices, and the development of understanding, aptitudes, and capabilities. Here we are by no means threatened by absorption in a social atmosphere, according to the critique Ricoeur directed against Havelock, which imperceptibly acting on individuals would reduce personal identity to a function of the group of a given social media. The interpretation of collective memory, established or elaborated thus far, permits us to set on a new foundation insight not only into the continuity between past and present in the framework of group existence, it also allows us to place in a different light the topic of discontinuity between group remembrance and the historical past that played such a prominent role in Ricoeur's work, as illustrated by the image of the sculpture of Clio and Kronos that he placed on the cover of Memory, History, and Forgetting, to which I alluded in the opening paragraphs of this work, of this talk. Here indeed, we reach the decisive point, revealing the deeper sources of what Ricoeur termed laceration, break, discontinuity, according to the terms that we have encountered. As Halbach appreciated in his book La Mémoire Collective, published posthumously in 1945, the vivacity of collective memory depends above all on shared experience that is remembered by living generations, which Ricoeur, in referring to Halbach in Memory, History, Forgetting, termed transgenerational memory, la mémoire transgénérationnelle. Ricoeur himself, in characterizing the break between collective memory and history, referred to what he aptly characterized, I think this term is wonderful, he aptly characterized in terms of the uncanny strangeness of the past. l'inquiétante étrangeté de l'histoire. Excuse me, uncanny strangeness of history. On the basis of my interpretation of the symbol and of the multiple symbolic stratifications that interweave the threads of collective memory, my aim is to account for and reinforce this qualification of discontinuity through investigation of the symbolic basis of the radical distinction that Ricoeur, following Halbach's, established between collective memory and the historical past. And here we come to the important point concerning the sources of discontinuity and of déchirure in the symbolic fabric of social cohesion. If collective remembrance of the past is always fragmented in accord with a plurality of different group perspectives, public communication depends upon a shared web of spontaneously graspable symbols that defines the contours of group contemporaneity shared by overlapping living generations in its discontinuity with the historical past beyond all living memory. This discontinuity is not simply a consequence of the death of single individuals or the demise of groups, for the disappearance of living generations signals the evanescence of the concrete context in which their symbolic interaction transpired. Following the disappearance of this theater of group interaction, the legibility of the symbolic structures embedded in it begins to weaken. Even where the broad intelligibility of general linguistic and other symbolic categories is retained over centuries, the more specific nuances groups invest in them, constituting the living context and intrinsic sense of their coexistence, are subject to remarkable, if often barely palpable, barely noticeable variability as collective memory recedes into the historical past. In a situation of radical discontinuity, the passage of each successive generation marks a drift in the symbolic framework of communication and interaction. Such an abrupt change in context, calling forth mostly imperceptible displacements of its passive recesses, casts in its wake a deepening shroud over this essential significance of the symbolic patterns that constitute the past's singular texture. Discontinuity in the shared context of remembrance marks the finitude of living groups. Beyond the finite existence of mortal individuals, group awareness is subject to a specific kind of finitude, set in relief by the limited reach of group remembrance beyond the horizon of recall of living generations. The finite temporal scope of this context comes to light in the collective inability, by virtue of any specific capacity of memory, to penetrate the remote depths of the historical past. This may be achieved to a very limited extent through historical reconstruction, in which memory in its proper sense plays only an indirect and very limited role. Beyond historical continuities that are presumed to retain the essential significance of past experience, this concept of collective memory highlights an incommensurable diversity of temporal contexts that underlie the historicity of human existence. As the nuances of contextual divergence fade from living memory, subtle metamorphoses in the symbolic underpinnings of group experience flowing from its passive reaches are no longer recalled to group awareness. The more fully the contours of contextual divergence between past and present are forgotten, the more readily nuances are effaced that distinguish collective memory from the historical past. I will conclude my talk by elucidating this theory by means of two brief examples. Perhaps I'll show a few of the next PowerPoint the next one, which is Ricoeur's book, and one further, and another one, because I read that already. So here you have Halbach's, a picture of Halbach in his book, published in 1945. And the next slide, and again, in Cassir's Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, published initially in 1923, 25, and 29. And another, oh, that's not yet. So we'll go back to the text and show that. So I will conclude my talk by elucidating this theory of collective memory in relation to the symbol and to Ricoeur by means of two brief examples. The first concerns Paul Ricoeur's illustration from the Biblian Abbey, history and the winged god Kronos, that I referred to at the outset of my analysis. As noted, Ricoeur chose this figure to adorn the cover of Memory, History, and Forgetting in order to symbolize his concept of the break in historical time and the attempt to prevent its loss by the muse of memory and history. As a symbolic representation, this choice is in itself indicative. For Ricoeur focused on what would seem to be readily decipherable symbols, since the ancient god Kronos and the muse Clio are emblems that, in spite of their antiquity, have retained their metaphorical sense over the course of the ages. In their familiarity, they would seem indeed to require little interpretation, even if to account for their original significance, the presence of pagan symbols in a German church indicates a complexity of contextual nuance of the Baroque perspective that surrounds the initial creation and appreciation of art in this period. Here, the more radical problem of discontinuity, as soon as we begin reflecting on pagan symbols in a German church, the problem of discontinuity begins to make its appearance. And this serves to illustrate the point I made earlier that the more specific nuances groups invest in symbols, constituting the living context of their coexistence, are subject to important, if often barely discernible, transformation as collective memory recedes into history. Following the victory of Napoleon Bonaparte at Austerlitz and the Peace of Pressburg in 1806, the Biblian Abbey was secularized. Its monks were dispersed, and the abbey itself was converted into a castle. In this context, the radicalism of the historical break introduced by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire brings to the fore more opaque, more unintelligible aspects of the transformation of the symbolic universe that transpires with the passage of the horizon of living generations into the historical past. And here I come to my second example. I can show the next slide. This one. And then we can go back to the in the first year of the 19th century, 1801, during a period of intense warfare with England and its allies, actually the second year of the 19th century, during a period of intense warfare with England and its allies, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was then first consul of France, placed an order for a painting from a contemporary artist, Anne-Louis Giraudet-Tréhuzon, to adorn the walls of his residence in Malmaison in Paris, where it still stands. This painting, entitled The Apotheosis of the French Heroes Who Died for Their Country During the War of Liberty, painted in 1802, portrayed three French generals, Louis-Charles-Antoine Desaix, Jean-Baptiste Kléber, and François Séverin Marceau, who had been killed in recent battles and are subsequently received in the afterworld by the Gaelic bard Ossian and the hero Fingal. This illustration evokes Ossian, the narrator of the poems supposedly transcribed by James Macpherson and published in 1762, which created a decades-long literary and artistic passion on a European scale that sparked Napoleon Bonaparte's ardent enthusiasm. Here, on his campaign in Egypt, he had a copy of Ossian in his pocket. In the painting, the realm of Ossian and of the hero Fingal replaces the traditional Christian symbols of apotheosis, providing a particularly suggestive motif that following the restoration of the European order in 1815, completely lost its symbolic power. People simply didn't understand the painting anymore. This loss, corresponding to the dampening of romantic enthusiasm for Gaelic mythology, illustrates the finite quality of context of experience and remembrance, translated into symbolic terms of style, attitude, and taste that comes to light with a particular clarity in times of sudden and fundamental transition. It illustrates the rapidity with which, after a few generations, the public intelligibility of signs, images, and monuments is subject to transformation. What changes is not simply the sense of isolated symbols, but a whole context of experience that is symbolically articulated by collective memory. Here, on the basis of transformation to which symbolic configurations in the intersubjective realm are subject, we may complement Ricoeur's insight into discontinuity by insisting on the role that critical awareness of it leads us to adopt. It incites us, above all, to underscore the risk involved where an illusory continuity is imposed upon a remote past, leading us to discount the radicalism of the break with the past and with its symbolic configurations. Here, the avowal of the uncanny strangeness of the past, in accord with Ricoeur's apt phrase, must lead us to reinforce our vigilance in regard to the tendency to overlay the past with meanings projected on it from our present vantage point, engendering blindness to its original symbolic relief. The fundamental distinction that I have drawn between collective memory and history has both a theoretical aim, but also an ethical purpose. And here, I think that Ricoeur would be in total agreement. Its ethical intention intends to marshal, fortify, and deepen Ricoeur's fruitful concept of the uncanny strangeness of the past. And it is inspired by the conviction concerning the elusiveness and indeed the opacity of those strata of group existence that reach beyond the passive levels of symbolic configuration. This consideration places in a dubious light facile presuppositions concerning long-term group continuity, allegedly forged by memory, that have become a contemporary rallying point for extremist political ideologies, a problem that I deal with in much detail in my book. From the works of Maurice Barrès to the late 19th century novelist and nationalist prophet, up until the pronouncements of more recent proponents of nationalist extremism, the discourse of collective memory has been marshaled, mobilized to attest an alleged homogeneity of national groups whose shared ethnic virtues are taken to constitute the durable matrix of national unity, and therefore to serve as the source of social cohesion, an illusory social cohesion. Against this attitude, the theory of collective memory, in highlighting the discontinuity between generations and the finite reach of group remembrance, reveals its eminently critical vocation. Thank you very much.
Jeffrey, thank you very much for your conference. So I think that we can put some questions to Jeffrey, not some questions. So, okay, Taylor, please. Where is it?
Jeffrey, thank you very much. My question is, I think that part of our contemporary predicament is you're talking about the uncanniness of in the distance, but isn't that part of the problem that there's a sense of loss that that some of the extremist groups are trying to recover symbols. My question is there a necessary loss of symbols so that we become more secularized and lose the symbolic world, or is there a potential for a continuation of the symbolic memory that we can have in a more progressive fashion rather than simply in a extremist fashion?
In other words, whether we are condemned to the finite scope of collective memory is basically what you're.
Well, or have we? I'm thinking partly of France, Pierre, Nora, the places of memory and so forth, and there's a sense that in many Western cultures that those have been lost, and so now we are secular. We have lost our sense of a sense of a collective memory, and so we're simply commercial, economic entities, and so that popular votes are indicating that there's a real resource that people are drawn to, whatever the political balance is. They want those symbolic memories to be recoverable, and you're pointing out they're strange.
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. In fact, I deal in my book, the first chapter of my book deals with the question, why is collective memory such a big theme for us? Why is we hear in all the different disciplines from anthropology to philosophy or history, sociology, people are talking about collective memory. Even neurology and physiology, we're looking for physiological traces. And my answer to that is that it has a lot to do with two phenomena. One of the phenomena is the concentration of the question of social cohesion on a purely anthropological basis. In other words, all of the traditional transcendent and transcendental solutions to the question of social cohesion that made collective memory something completely secondary and ancillary, all of a sudden are no longer have the same hold on the public world. And all of our explanations are essentially anthropological in their scope. And connected to this is the successive waves of discontinuity that begin really with the French Revolution and go through the First World War, which I think is another incredible moment of discontinuity. It's no accident that Walter Benjamin, Proust, and Halbachs all belong to the generation that's emphasizing this discontinuity following the First World War. When you think of Benjamin's storyteller, it's all dealing with a discontinuity in society following the return of the soldiers from the war who can no longer communicate their experience. Or Proust also dealing with the First World War and the difference in the salon societies, that everything changes in a certain way, and Halbachs as well is dealing with the same phenomenon. And I think that the importance of collective memory now, I mean, people are always saying, oh, it has a lot to do with all of the different traumatisms and genocides. This, of course, is important, but I think the fundamental reason for the emphasis on collective memory is much more the problem of discontinuity and the inability to have any kind of recourse to traditional answers to the question, whether metaphysics, a kind of a metaphysical answer to the question, a traditional theological answer to the question. I'm not saying that there's no theological answer, but the traditional theological answer in which it was not so much of a problem has become very difficult. And so the tendency in the public world is to concentrate on anthropological foundations. And so all of a sudden you ask, well, what holds it all together? It's exactly the question that you're asking, and explains the importance of all of these attempts to create museums, archives, to kind of account for some kind of a source of a social cohesiveness that is extremely elusive in our contemporary world. It has to do with our contemporary pluralism, and it has to do with also the critical remark that I introduced at the end, which is a very important part of my book. And that is with the mass media as the essential source of configuration of public space, that there's an ever greater distance between individuals, small groups, immediate experience, and publicly constituted experience that is filtered through the mass media. That this introduces a gap that did not exist even 4 or 5 decades ago. And the important thing is that the media are able to simulate ever more perfectly with this technological, this incredible technological capacity, are able to simulate direct experience in the life world, and to give us the impression that we are actually experiencing things that we are not experiencing. And this is very problematic, because then all of a sudden we're looking for ways of making an elusive public experience meaningful to us on a personal and a small group level. And this is extremely difficult to do. And one of the ways of doing it is by finding some kind of traces of a tangible past that we display in museums, in commemorations, 100 years and 10 years. I mean, commemorations, as Ricoeur saw very clearly, and Pierre Nora, they become much more common, much more important to us. But this is the reason, I think. And I think that it's not entirely negative. I mean, I think that also Ricoeur is right in emphasizing the plurality of perspectives. I think that the plurality and the multiplicity of perspectives and the ability to interweave them is the great difficulty and also the challenge, but it's something that cannot be overcome by this recourse to a kind of homogeneity of group memories that many extremist groups talk about. In my book, I deal a lot with this. I actually did a lot of empirical work looking at the discourses of different groups in different countries, starting with the war in ex-Yugoslavia, where it is extremely striking. The way in which memory is mobilized as a source of social cohesion and an expression of social homogeneity. And this is a great danger, and this is the negative side of collective memory.
One more question. Alan,
J'ai une question assez simple en fait.
Oui.
C'est parce que ce que vous me dites fait penser vraiment à l'idéologie.
Oui.
Quel est le rapport entre mémoire collective et idéologie, c'est-à-dire comme imagination sociale,
Oui.
l'imaginaire social.
Tout à fait.
Et aussi, parce que dans Histoire, Mémoire, Oubli, Ricoeur parle aussi de l'institution comme médiation historique.
Oui, tout à fait.
Or, l'idéologie comme l'institution sont des interprétations, elles sont fragiles. Ça rend compte en partie de la discontinuité.
C'est extrêmement important. Je pense aussi à Castoriadis, n'est-ce pas, avec la notion d'imaginaire social. J'opère une distinction très importante pour moi entre une mythologie politique et une idéologie. Parce que je pense que les idéologies au sens traditionnel du terme, quand on parle du marxisme ou quand on parle de l'idéologie libérale ou l'idéologie même conservatrice, ce sont des idéologies dans la mesure où il y a une forme de rationalisation, il y a un souci de totalisation de l'histoire à partir de... Alors que pour moi, on peut parler d'idéologie, mais je trouve le terme de mythologie politique plus approprié pour la situation contemporaine, justement dans la mesure où il y a cette fragmentation dont je parle qui est accentuée dans notre contexte actuel. Et je crois que le terme de François Hartog est un terme extrêmement approprié. je n'accepte pas totalement ce qu'il dit, mais quand il parle de présentisme et l'idée d'un présentisme actuel qui, en quelque sorte, rend caduques les idéologies et les philosophies de l'histoire traditionnelle. Je pense qu'il va trop loin dans cette. Je crois que il n'y a pas que présentisme et la mythologie politique ouvre l'espace à une forme de nostalgie qui ne peut pas être qualifiée par l'étiquette de présentisme, à mon sens. C'est plus complexe que ça. Mais néanmoins, je crois qu'il voit quelque chose de très important dans la mesure où il dit qu'il y a un déplacement que les idéologies et les philosophies de l'histoire au sens traditionnel qui dépendaient d'une certaine idée de l'État-nation traditionnel sont entrés dans un nouveau stade de l'histoire. Et dans cette mesure-là, je crois que sa qualification de présentisme dans le régime d'historicité est très appropriée, même s'il y a quelques limites à sa critique de Koselleck, etc. Et c'est pour cette raison que je crois que le mot d'idéologie, on peut l'utiliser, bien entendu, mais le mot de mythologie politique, il y a aussi une autre raison. C'est que j'ai parlé de la mémoire qui est une mémoire explicite, mémoire qui est mise en scène, comme dit Ricoeur, dans les commémorations, dans les musées, les archives. Il y a aussi une mémoire latente, une mémoire passive, une mémoire qui est mobilisée à certains moments, mais une mémoire qui serait un peu un habitus, qui serait l'éthos au sens d'Aristote, au fond, et qui serait vraiment une passivité remémorée qui peut traverser, bien entendu, traverser aussi, subir certaines métamorphoses, mais néanmoins traverser des générations entières. Et c'est la manière de mobiliser cela en termes d'une certaine vision de l'homogénéité que j'appelle une véritable mythologie politique à l'âge actuel. Enfin, c'est en ce sens que évidemment, je ne veux pas faire une distinction trop grande entre idéologie et mythe politique parce que les deux se côtoient. Il n'y a pas de, mais je crois qu'il y a une petite différence d'accent, tel que je le vois.
Perhaps one more question or enough for now. Cláudio Nascimento. So one more question with Cláudio Nascimento, and then we finish our work today. Cláudio, please.
Jeffrey, merci beaucoup pour ton exposé. C'est un éclaircissement que je vous demande. Si j'ai bien compris, à partir du texte en portugais, de la traduction, tu es intéressé sur la possibilité de la communicabilité collective de l'expérience. Hein? Et tu as parlé aussi de niveau de passivité sous-jacent à l'expérience. Dans ta réponse maintenant en anglais, peut-être que j'ai bien compris, tu as parlé un peu de l'expérience de la télévision, des gens qui regardent la télé. Peut-être ma question c'est comment nous arrivons à ces niveaux de passivité. Si tu peux expliquer un petit plus.
Oui, c'est un point important aussi. Je suis parti dans beaucoup de mes analyses de Husserl, bien entendu. Et aussi en parlant de ce concept de passivité. Je crois que les deux cours de Husserl sur les synthèses passives et puis sur les 3 volumes sur l'intersubjectivité, où il est très souvent question de passivité. Je pense que c'est vraiment une source extrêmement importante. Dans la mesure, en plusieurs sens. D'abord parce que il n'y a jamais une passivité pure. C'est ce que explique Husserl, et très bien. Il explique que la question activité-passivité, c'est plutôt une possibilité qui gravite entre les deux pôles, et jamais une pure activité, une pure passivité. Mais la passivité concerne beaucoup de structures. C'est-à-dire que, d'abord, je crois que la notion de passivité phénoménologique, pourquoi Husserl? Justement parce que, pour moi, on a tendance dans notre société de penser que toute forme de passivité est psychologique. Dès qu'on parle passivité, on parle inconscient, au sens de Freud. Je n'ai rien contre l'inconscient au sens de Freud, mais je crois que peut-être on a trop psychologisé la notion de latence et trop psychologisé, et je crois qu'il y a vraiment un domaine extrêmement important à éclairer à partir d'une méthode phénoménologique qui laisse de côté la dimension psychologique de la question et qui creuse dans les racines pour retrouver l'éthos d'Aristote, l'habitus, même Bourdieu, finalement, il ne fait que remobiliser l'éthos aristotélicien. Il le dit lui-même. Il a trouvé le terme d'habitus quand il a traduit Panofsky. Et son livre L'architecture gothique et la scolastique, où il utilise le terme d'habitus, et là, Bourdieu rencontre ce concept. Je crois que ce concept est extrêmement important. Et la passivité doit être donc pensée non pas dans une dimension non psychologique, mais dans une dimension un peu plus qui englobe toute une capacité anthropologique, si vous voulez. Où la question simple de mécanisme psychologique en tant que tel joue un rôle vraiment secondaire. C'est valable, bien entendu, mais ce n'est pas la seule forme de passivité, et à mon sens, ce n'est même pas la forme la plus fondamentale. Et ça, Husserl l'a vu avec une clarté. Enfin, la grande importance des cours sur la synthèse passive, c'est de nous montrer en quoi consiste la passivité, et quel est son rapport avec l'activité, comment penser mémoire et imagination, non pas comme faculté isolée, mais plutôt comme capacité déployée à partir d'une structure anthropologique tout entière. Je crois que là, bon, Husserl ne parle pas d'anthropologie, mais j'ai un peu rompu comme Ricoeur avec les modèles de la subjectivité transcendantale. Ça, avec lui, je laisse ça de côté. Mais je crois que néanmoins, comme Ricoeur, je crois qu'il a énormément de choses à nous montrer, et notamment par rapport à ce concept. Merci pour la question.
So, thank you, Jeffrey. It was a wonderful conference.
Thank you very much.